What if I was to tell you that there's a game that's a mixture of Resident Evil, Metal Gear Solid, and your typical point-and-click adventure game, wrapped in the body of a Saturday morning cartoon and with a mature rating? Does anything come to mind? Well, the game that we're going to be taking a look at was obscure when it was released, so I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't ring a bell. But it was also revolutionary in the technology that it managed to implement on the PlayStation 1, pushing the medium to be the newest contender on the block for storytelling. So let's take a closer look at Fear Effect. In today's gaming world, there are so many things that we just overlook. Things that we take for granted, that get pushed to the back of our minds, that become no more than information that automatically processes without us having to take any notice of its presence. In the last few videos that I've put up, I've been analysing these things. Whether it be pre-rendered backgrounds made by an artist that's set in a scene, or the subtle ways that the characters can convey personality with simple dialogue. Each game had its unique way of pushing their methods of storytelling, trying to provide that cinematic feel that video games lacked at the time. But then came a little game from a studio called Kronos Digital Entertainment. This project managed to stop taking pigeon steps forward and instead take leaps by putting all the work that other developers had put out there and took it a step further with a little thing that they called MotionFX technology. Instead of explaining what this tech is, I'll just go over a few moments from the opening of the game to see the way that the technology was used in conjunction with the rest of the game design. See whether it worked for the better or for worse. See if it complemented the gameplay or stifled it. And most of all, see how it aged and whether this set the stage for the games that came after it. When you start the game, you're treated to a narrated cinematic of what looks like a cult. Odd-looking people in hooded robes carrying a coffin. All whilst the narrator explains some cryptic account of wanting to die. This doesn't have much importance until later on in the game, but it's interesting nonetheless. And whilst this goes on, you get a hint of what type of game this is going to be that you're playing, by setting everything up in the same way that a Hollywood movie would. First they show some random person doing something elaborate that's completely stripped of context, giving you a nugget of information that won't be important till later on. This is their way of sinking their hooks into you, hoping that what was shown was enough to spark your curiosity, but also to signal to you that this is more than just your regular game. This is in the same league as movies. It also helps the effect with the credits being rolled within the scene, with 90s style flames engulfing the text, with a bombastic heavy guitar song to go with it. Once the scene comes to a close, you're taken back to 24 hours before, and now your location is revealed, a futuristic Hong Kong, covered in skyscrapers, rain-filled air, and searchlights panning back and forth. The next shot is taken inside the flying car that's being flown by two of the protagonists, mercs on their way to a mission, as told by the narrator. You can kind of see where the developers were going here. With the game's aesthetic resembling anime movies, it further separates it from your typical game that would have come out at the time, putting itself in the same leagues as stuff like Ghost in the Shell and Akira, both being impactful movies for cinema and adult animation at the time. This game wanted to have that same impact, but for gaming. We now know this art style as cel shading, but back then this was a brand new concept. 3D games were still in their early stages at this point, and in turn so was the scope of art styles available. But this demonstrates the architecture that laid the groundwork for developers to springboard future projects, with studios like Arc System Works being the masters of this style today. Just check out the latest Dragon Ball Z game, it's pretty much perfected this look. The chosen artistic approach also makes textures look like nothing else on the system. Comparing the models from this game to the models in something like Resident Evil 3, you can see how much more detail was able to be shown using the cel shading. Another thing that's present here is the acting. It seems that the game takes the voiceovers seriously when many titles at the time had really corny voice acting. Just from the dialogue you can tell that the characters have known each other for a long time, from the banter that they have with each other, making fun of what would be considered a serious matter with lives at stake. But these two just use the situation as something to joke about.
You trust him?
Jin's reliable.
Yeah? How do you know?
He helped me get out of the streets years back, before he threw in with the triad. He's always got an angle, but I'd say he's a friend.
When you're talking about this kind of money, you can lose friends in a hurry. And once we find the girl, we are talking about this kind of money, right, Hana?
Wei Ming Lam is the daughter of the most powerful triad leader in Hong Kong. Don't worry, Glass. If we reach his little runaway first, Lam will pay us handsomely to get her back.
Of course, he'll want us dead as well.
There, that's it. The Lam building.
Now, onto the actual game. Once the cutscene's over, you get to see the MotionFX technology at work. What you're looking at here is a full motion video being used in place of a pre-rendered background. It may look archaic by today's standards. The FMVs look more like footage from an old phone camera with the amount of compression. But if you were to hook this up to an old school TV like the game was intended to be played on, you'll see how good this game can look. Stretching it to fit a HD TV completely breaks the effect. But putting ourselves into our 1999 shoes, this would have been the first time we'd seen anything like it. The dynamics of the traffic in the background, the different forms of light being shined, be it vehicle headlights or searchlights beaming in the distance. It all helps to set the scene and really breathes life into the play area. Nowadays, everything is rendered in real time and on the spot, but back then, it was out of the question on the hardware. So this tech really was revolutionary for its time. The next cool thing we see is how the game can seamlessly blend gameplay and video. With everything looking consistent, they can swap out gameplay for FMV without it breaking the immersion, or without the need for any load screens. It's pretty seamless, and this is a major element used for the storytelling aspect of the game. Being able to go from gameplay to a full-on cutscene without a load screen or even difference in visuals for that matter, really enhanced the flow of the story and really helped to engross players into the world, giving them an incentive to try things out and see what would happen next. Today we have these scenes also rendered in real time, but you do have the odd occasion when FMVs are still used and they still stick out like a sore thumb. The next screen at first glance is just a walkway, but if you look, you'll see the small details in the background. Again, distant lights from vehicles. You've got spinning fans gushing smoke from the grates beneath your feet. Neon signs flicker and billboards change their digital images to show new advertisements. Rotating lights cast shadows as it moves. I hate to say it again, but this may not seem like too much of a big deal, but when compared to the real-time shadows generated by the game engine, the little circles under the model, the difference is night and day. They even managed to make contextual moments that take advantage of the seamless FMV cuts. For example, when you approach this window, you're able to break the glass with your weapon, and the whole thing plays out in this stylistic way, weaving in-game and cutscene together. By doing it this way, it also makes the objects that you interact with not stick out like they do in regular PS1 games, with the background and models usually looking completely different from one another, where the item is generated by the engine as opposed to being part of the background. This gives everything a natural look and helps it to all blend together, a consistency in visuals not seen before on the PlayStation. It may not seem like it now, but back then it felt like you was in control of a movie. I remember at the time people would say, one day games will look as good as the cutscenes, and this game was by far the first steps into that being a reality. Let's fast forward a little. Before we enter the next area, let's take a look at some more of the motion effects. Here is a better example of how the game uses lighting as it pierces through the holes of a moving fan into a smoke-filled room. Pretty crazy that a simple room without much of a function apart from being able to save the game has such a level of detail. But what I really wanted to mention was how they used the FMV style backgrounds to do a zoom out effect as you run down the stairs. This doesn't use any scaling or any other method used before, but gives a real nice cinematic feel, especially if you run in all guns blazing and kill the bad guys. The best we would have had before this would have been some kind of parallax background scrolling behind the foreground. But this went for the cinematic approach, which developers didn't even know they had as an option at the time for these kind of games. So I think I've managed to get across what the technology did and the impact it had from the development perspective. But a game looking the part is nothing if it doesn't play well. Sadly, this is one of those games that I think you either love or hate in this regard. Remember all the games that I said that it was similar to in the intro? Well, let me go over why I think it takes aspects from each of them. So the most obvious is Resident Evil. This game uses the same kind of structure, with areas being locked until the right item or tool is found, whether it be a key or an access card or something along those lines. The levels are essentially puzzle boxes, where things that may not do something the first time around may have something important later on when you have the correct item to use with it. Also, the movement is handled the same, with tank controls being the method used, which makes sense really because not everybody had a DualShock controller to take advantage of the analog sticks. The game also makes use of multiple camera angles, making regular controls kinda clunky to keep the character oriented the way that you want them to be, which also plays into the next title on the list, Metal Gear Solid. In Fear Effect, if you make a mistake, you can't just take a ton of bullets or attack without being taken down. So this game relies on you playing stealthily and think through how you're going to deal with situations. It achieves this by giving you options to walk whilst crouching, as well as sidestepping and tactical rolls that you can use to get in and out of cover. Now the last example, adventure games. This game could have easily have been a point and click game. It plays pretty similar to titles like Grim Fandango. The puzzles in this game are not made to be a walk in the park, and the game doesn't hold your hand. It expects you to try things and retread old areas to see if you can use new items to progress. It also has the pacing of an adventure game. Even though things story-wise are presented as if they're on time limits and things must happen quickly, in actual fact the game plays out at a leisurely pace, giving you time to think and assess each of the situations or puzzles. Each flavour of gameplay complement one another for the most part. It doesn't feel like multiple of the top games at the time sewn together to make some kind of hybrid, but rather a game that took inspiration from many places and tried to make it all work in their own way. An all in all interesting experiment in the way that we consume the medium of video games. What I think Chronos set out to do with Fear Effect was to make a game that could be everything to everyone. The puzzle game for the sharp-minded people, the stealth and shooting for the action gamer, the pacing and story for fans of narrative, all wrapped up and presented in a fashion that everybody is accustomed to, a movie. But with so much going on under the hood of the game, as well as the multiple mechanics given to the player, I think it ended up being too much too soon. This title never went on to become the household name like the rest of the titles I listed. I mainly think this is because they become the pinnacle of their respected genres, whereas Fear Effect now seems like no more than just an interesting experiment that showed that the medium could be so much more. We take so much for granted these days, with games looking photorealistic and developers having engines that can just make development a lot more straightforward. It was projects like this that helped pave the way for the kind of standards that we would expect in games that we play today. The fact that this gem had so much stuff happening on screen in the first few minutes of gameplay is crazy. It really engrosses you into the world and makes you feel like it's alive and dynamic. Comparing it to its contemporaries, I think Chronos managed to pull off what the devs of the other games I mentioned had pictured from the start, but it proving to be a lot harder to implement than anticipated. The pre-rendered backgrounds in the Resident Evil games would work like a GIF file at best, but I bet they would have jumped at the chance to have a fully animated background, something that they did many years later in the remake. Silent Hill had a fully rendered environment instead of pre-renders, but due to the limitations of the console it could just about run, so they needed the fog to hide the pop-in. Luckily in both cases, what was implemented worked, and the games have gone on to become household names. Sadly, the same can't be said for Fear Effect. Sometimes certain games and studios can end up being the equivalent of canaries in the coal mine. They put the groundwork in for others to pick up and expand on, but they aren't remembered in the same way as the better alternatives that came after them, or before them in that case. And this is why it's great that we have YouTube to be able to rekindle these conversations and give credit where credit's due, as well as teaching younger gamers about these forgotten titles and giving them the praise that they deserve. Well, I hope you liked this video. Bit of an odd game, not sure if you've heard of it, but tell me what you thought of it in the comments below, or tell me in the Discord channel, links in the description. Subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Press the little bell as well, because that's a thing now apparently on YouTube. And I'll see you in the next video.